So thanks for coming to listen to me talk. I realise we're at a VR conference and I work for a big NGO, and that may not necessarily be the most exciting or relevant thing, but hopefully it'll be interesting nonetheless. So yeah, my name's Pete Speller. I work for Greenpeace International, specifically in the forest campaign team. My role is a mix of kind of supporting our offices around public engagement work, but also something, digital innovation, whatever that means, and that's why I've been interested in VR. So I'm going to talk about three things. The first bit, sort of setting the scene a little bit about what different NGOs have been doing with virtual reality. A little bit about Greenpeace and why we're interested in it, and then a bit about what we want to do in the future, kind of where we see it going. And then at the end, there's a bit of a kind of request to come and get involved in with Greenpeace, really. And also, as I was quite pleased with what the previous speaker, I'm sorry I don't know his name, but what he was saying about terminology around VR. I know there's a difference between 360 video and VR, but I'm kind of using VR as a shorthand for both. So please don't hate me for that. So there's already a lot of NGOs. If you're not familiar with the term NGO, it stands for non-governmental organization. It's a catch-all for all sorts of different non-profit organizations. All charities are NGOs, not all NGOs are charities. That's a kind of particular distinction. And these are a bunch of the organizations that I've seen doing really interesting stuff with VR. Obviously, the UN UNICEF Clouds over Sidra is really exciting and very famous piece of work. But also there's this one, I don't know if you've seen it, Too Much Information from the National Autistic Society, was an incredible, incredible piece of work. And what we're seeing is that it's an incredibly effective tool for engaging people in the things that we do, explaining our work, the things that we campaign on. But also, crucially, for organizations that rely on the generosity of people for our funding. We don't make money in the same way that private enterprise does. It's showing to be a very useful tool for fundraising as well. And obviously, Clouds over Sidra is a very famous example of that, where they took it to the Davos World Economic Forum and they raised billions of dollars for Syrian refugees. So fundraising is a very powerful way that we can use VR. I think there's someone from Save the Children talking a bit more about VR fundraising tomorrow. So I'm not going to talk too much about fundraising. My work is more in campaigning and communications. So that's really where I think the power of VR can be, not just in fundraising. And particularly, I'm going to use the term storytelling, for kind of experimental storytelling, different ways of communicating. And there's two projects I want to mention. One's not VR, the other one's not an NGO, so perhaps they're not necessarily relevant, but really interesting things. This War of Mine, if you've seen it, an incredible way of communicating what it's like to be a civilian during a siege. And then obviously The Guardian 6x9. And these kind of embody this principle that we try and put in our work at Greenpeace of show, don't tell. We have a habit, I think, of throwing information at people and hoping that it sticks, and that doesn't always work. So these are very interesting and sympathetic ways of storytelling, and if you haven't seen them, really do check them out. So why is Greenpeace interested in virtual reality? So I want to talk a little bit of the history of Greenpeace, because I'm sure you have heard of Greenpeace at some point, but beyond maybe environmental stuff or beards, boats and banners, as one person put it, perhaps you don't know a great deal about a lot of the stuff that we do. And so first of all, there's two fantastic beards in this photo. This is a quote from one of the founders of Greenpeace, Ben Metcalfe, and Greenpeace is founded on one of our founding principles is the act of bearing witness. Bearing witness, as Ben Metcalfe described it, is once you have witnessed an injustice, you cannot claim ignorance. For that inaction, you make an ethical choice to act or not. And that's really at the heart of our work. We try and allow people to bear witness with us. And we use, so for decades, we've traveled all over the world, and we've used every piece of technology we can get our hands on to try and bear witness. Our ships, and we have 3 of them, the Rainbow Warrior, the Esperanza, and the Arctic Sunrise, allow us to reach any part of the planet, and our communications technology allows us to bring these stories to people all over the world and allow them to bear witness with us and make their own choice of whether they act. So, to some extent, our interest in VR is just a continuation of our history of what we've always done. When we were filming very famous footage of the anti-whaling campaigns back in the 80s, Greenpeace activists putting their bodies, climbing on the back of a whale, putting their bodies between a whale and a harpoon. We filmed this on film and sent it out around the world, and it really changed an entire industry. Not long after our campaigning on that, the international moratorium on whaling was signed. And so it's an incredibly, we feel this is an incredibly effective thing to do, but at the moment, excuse me, it's becoming a much harder task. The rise of social media means that we fundamentally changed the way that we communicate and consume information. And when you've only got 140 characters, how do you explain something as complex as climate change or deforestation, and how do you evoke empathy in your audience towards those situations? And also, how do you give them that choice to act? And we've all heard that quote from Chris Milk about VR being the empathy machine. What's really interesting is there's actually some evidence to back this up. These are 2 studies from Stanford University's Virtual Human Interaction Lab that looked at the impact of VR on environmental activities in people. What they show is that actually vivid experiences through virtual reality, they actually can increase people's involvement, increase the sense of value that people show towards the environment, potentially even eliciting pro-environmental behavior change. So it's actually it appears to be an incredibly important tool for us to be using. And we've also seen a really good response from the first few experiments we've done with 360 video just last year. So this was our first film that we released called A Journey to the Arctic, and it is literally a journey to the Arctic. We took a very simple 360 camera up on our ship, the Arctic Sunrise, which is an icebreaker that can go right up to the almost up to the North Pole. This was made by Greenpeace Nordic and released initially across the Nordic region, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. And it had an incredibly positive response. We sent it out with our street teams and our local groups. And across the board, the number of people that stop and have a conversation, the number of people that sign a petition, the number of people that send an email to a business leader or a politician, the number of people who give a donation, they're all increasing because of VR compared to our traditional baselines. Not by earth-shattering amounts. It's not this sudden kind of, magic bullet that's just going to solve everything for us. But it's enough to kind of indicate that there's something here that we need to work out how we use. And also, as I mentioned previously, the Clouds Over Sidra film for the UN was very good with major donor and VIP supporters. And earlier this year, we started working with, there's one of our street teams in, I think they're in Denmark, Copenhagen, anyway, so yeah. Earlier this year, we started working with Alchemy VR, and we took a version of their Great Barrier Reef film to Glastonbury. This is the man himself, Michael Eavis, watching it inside. We have this huge white dome. We have a whole field at Glastonbury Festival. Michael Eavis is very generous and gives us that. And this was an enormous success. We had people queuing for hours, some of them, 3-4 hours, to watch a 5-minute virtual reality film. And so this was an incredibly successful piece of work. And again, we're taking it back to Glastonbury this year with new content. So what's next for us? Well, we made an app. So, having seen the success of, things like the New York Times VR app and various other people doing it, we've actually created our own VR app, and this, I think, if it plays, is a little video. It's still a draft version of this video, but hopefully it will play. Yeah, there we go. So that's not actually released yet. It'll be available in about a month or so's time, initially on Google Cardboard. Is it going to move on? Yeah. And first of all, it'll be released on Google Cardboard. We're working on a version for Gear VR, but it's a bit more expensive, a bit more complex. I understand, I don't know. And this app, what we'll do is we'll have both kind of 360 content, but also other videos, information about our campaigns. People will watch the videos through a cardboard headset that they can give a donation, and we'll send it out to them. And then they'll be able to, depending on the specific campaign, this is just sort of placeholder text on there at the moment, depending on what the campaign ask is, we'll ask people to sign a petition, email a business leader or a politician, or give a donation, depending on the content. And so we have big plans to, we want to create a lot more content. We don't have a lot at the moment. We're not experts in it. We don't have the facilities to do this stuff right now, but we want to do this. We see the value that this has to our work. So this will be coming out soon. Next up is a project that has been in development for more than a year now, and we're releasing later this year. And so, yeah, a little over a year ago, I met someone called Grace Boyle, who is at this event, and she runs a company called The Feelies, and what they do is very interesting. So adding kind of external stimuli to a VR film is not necessarily anything new. It's been done a lot. But what her team do is actually very interesting. They are multi-sensory storytellers, so they're not just coming in at the end of a project or halfway through and saying, how do we add a smell to this or a touch of something? They actually work with us right from the beginning to design a story that is told through all of our senses, and that's really what we're trying to do. On the team that she has is, there's a perfumer, experimental chefs, scientists. It's a very science-based approach, which I think is particularly interesting. So we took them and Alchemy VR again out to the Amazon, and we shot a VR film about the Munduruku people. And the Munduruku live in a part of the Amazon called the Tapajos Basin, and they have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they are currently facing the total destruction of their village through the construction of mega dams on the river. The village that we were in, called Sare Maiba, will be roughly 60 meters underwater if the construction of the dam goes ahead. So what we want to do is use some of the stuff that I mentioned previously around the way that vivid imagery and immersive environments can actually change people's behaviors, is use this as a tool to see if in Brazil, where the perception of indigenous people is very controversial, there's a lot of polarizing opinion around them. They're often seen same way that the right-wing media here talks about immigrants or dole scroungers. That lazy people get handouts from the government, they're just blocking development, etc., etc. So what we want to do is use this as a way to try and engage the Brazilian public. We also take it global, but particularly in Brazil, use this as a way to try and start to change that opinion in a much softer way than simply shouting, these people's lives are in danger, because we've done that for 40 years and it doesn't seem to work. So what we hope this will allow people to do is put themselves in the shoes of the Munduruku people and understand in a more empathetic way what their story is, why they're trying to block the construction of this dam, and how much it will actually affect their lives. So that will be coming out later this year. So I'm kind of coming to the end. I've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll go away in a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about the other stuff that we do. So we've done a little bit about the Arctic, and we've done this interesting piece on the Amazon, but one of the things that I realized, I've been to a few of these kind of VR events and these sorts of things, is there's loads of people out there producing interesting VR stuff, but there aren't many stories necessarily. And one thing that Greenpeace is I feel like we're sitting on a mountain of stories that we don't tell, we don't talk about. we don't communicate. And this is an example of one of those stories. So in 2014, our investigations unit, we have a big investigations unit that we rarely talk about because a lot of their work is undercover, snuck into a truck stop in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, that's here, under cover of night. They planted GPS trackers on a bunch of logging trucks and used satellite imagery and on the ground, like following them, to follow them to a deforestation site in the middle of the Amazon where they were cutting down a species of CITES-listed endangered wood called ipe. We then tracked them from that location to this sawmill, and then we tracked them from the sawmill to a port in Brazil called Santarém. From Santarém, it gets shipped out to Europe. Because of this investigation, we were able to work with the federal prosecutors in Brazil and have the sawmill investigated and shut down, stemming that flow of illegally logged endangered timber into Europe. And we talked a bit about it at the time, but there's a fascinating story there that is waiting to be told, I think. Another piece of work that we don't talk about is the two firefighting teams that we have, one in Russia and one in Indonesia. And they are specially trained volunteers that go out and fight forest fires, particularly in peatland. I don't know if you've ever come across a peat fire. Most rainforest, actually, well, a lot of forest is on deep peat, sometimes up to 10 meters deep. When you have a fire in a peatland, it burns through the forest very quickly, but under the ground, it burns deep, 4, 5, 6 meters for months at a time. And it emits an enormous amount of toxic smog. The worst year on record was back in 2000, when Indonesia's forest fires meant that Indonesia was responsible for 40% of total global CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. 2015 came very close to that. I don't know the exact numbers because we're still waiting for the final analysis on it, but it came very close. So our firefighters, whenever we use satellite mapping to track hotspots in forests, and our firefighters go out there and try and put these fires out. And it's incredibly dangerous work, and they are volunteers. If you've ever got your foot stuck in mud or in a peat bog, that's kind of the same situation, only now imagine that peat is burning at 600 degrees. It's incredibly dangerous work, and the fog or the smoke that it creates is thick and toxic. So these are just a couple of examples of things that we've done or that we're doing. There's more stuff. So next week our ship, sorry, that was a bit loud. Next week our ship Esperanza is going down to Brazil, where, I don't know if you saw in the news last year, they discovered one of the world's largest coral reefs just at the mouth of the Amazon rainforest. We're going down there, we're taking a submarine, we have a submarine as well. And we will, I think, be getting the first ever footage of this new reef. I haven't seen any footage of it, and I don't know that there's any available. We don't have anyone doing 360 filming or VR on this, and we'd love to take you with us. The Arctic Sunrise, which was pretty soundly trashed by the Russians in 2013 when they seized it, is currently being fixed and refit. After that, it'll head back up to the Arctic, probably either Svalbard or Baffin Bay near Greenland. Again, as far as I know, there's no one doing 360 or any VR work on that. And of course, our forest firefighting teams will be out again as soon as the fire season starts in September. We've also got a field research team. This is the Congo rainforest. We've got a field research team heading out to the Congo later this year. So I guess kind of here, this is my offer or my request. We're out there doing these things all the time. We're not experts in VR production, 360 filmmaking, visual effects, games design, any of these things. But we recognize that it has an enormous value to our work. What we do have are stories. These things are happening all the time. Every week we've got someone dangling off a building or a bridge with a banner. We've got our ships circumnavigating the globe every single year. We have offices and logistics units in 55 countries. We have experience working in some of the most extreme and challenging environments on the planet, from the Arctic to the Amazon and everywhere in between. So if you've got an idea for a product or a film, or you just like the idea of working with us, then please come and speak to me, because we would love to do a lot more of these sorts of things, this kind of softer approach, show don't tell type storytelling. And we're great at campaigning, we're great at finding out, how timber is being moved around the world, but we're not game designers, we're not storytellers. So yeah, come and work with us, and that's it, thanks.